Dead America, the Second Month, The Portland Conflict Part 3. Written by Derek Slayton. Narrated by Aaron Smith. Chapter 1. Day 0 plus 40. Zion, Jinx, and Jarvis slowly floated down the river, staying far away from the shore as they only had the moonlight to guide them. It had been a few hours since they had secured boats, and they were taking their time navigating downstream, saving their strength for the battle to come. As they floated, using the oars to keep them straight, they admired the view, the skyscrapers in the distance reflecting in the moonlight. The only sound, other than the flowing of the water, were the moans. So much moaning. Tens of thousands of ghouls on both sides of them. It almost sounded hauntingly beautiful, as long as one ignored what was making the sound in the first place. "How much further we got, Jarvis?" the corporal asked. She looked at the map, getting her bearings. "Maybe another half-mile or so," she said. "If we hit the island, we've gone too far." "Good. Still a little more time to kick back," Zion said. "Rest of this day is gonna suck. Might as well enjoy what we can." "Don't get too comfortable," Jinx quipped. "Need you ready to smash some heads, because from the sounds of it, there's going to be a lot." "It's gonna be a hell of a run from wherever we dock to the hospital," Zion said. "Not to mention what we're going to face once we're in there." Jarvis tilted her head back and forth. "If you think about it, there's a good chance it won't be so bad in there," she piped up. "What the hell are you talking about?" Jinx asked, blinking at her in confusion. "The hospital is going to be ground zero for those things. It would have been filled with sick people when they started to turn, and those runners would have chased out the non-infected people," she pointed out. "It's not like survivors were sitting around thinking, you know where we should take refuge? The hospital." Zion couldn't help but smirk at the corporal. "I think she's got you there," he drawled. "Yeah, we'll see, though," Jinx muttered. "Although I'm this close to reprimanding you for that comment, Private." "What?" she demanded. "Why?" "Because saying shit like that is how you jinx us," the corporal explained. "It's like an EMT saying that it's going to be a quiet shift, or a teacher saying, oh yeah, this is going to be a well-behaved class. Or a guy going on a date thinking those eyes don't look too crazy. Never ends well." Zion chuckled. "Sounds like you speaking from experience there," he said. "Oh, I've sworn off relationships," Jinx declared. "Tell him why," Jarvis prompted, lip curling in a small smirk. The corporal paused, letting out a sigh. "Because I didn't think the eyes looked too crazy," he admitted. Zion let out such a hearty belly laugh that he nearly tipped the boat over. "Sorry, girl, sorry," he said as he stabilized the boat. "That's just too good." He wiped fake tears from his eyes. "Oh, come on. Don't tell me you've never rode the crazy train," Jinx accused. "Shit, man. I was all about making money when I was back in the hood," Zion replied, waving him off. "Didn't care about dating or going out, just making what I could so I could get out. Of course, with my job, I saw plenty of other guys taking their own trip to Crazy Town. That was more than enough for me." The corporal nodded. "So what was your job, if you don't mind me asking?" he asked. "I was a gang enforcer," Zion said with a self-deprecating chuckle. "Really?" Jinx asked, blinking at him in shock. "Okay. How did you get into that?" The larger man flexed his arms. "'Cause look at me," he replied. "When I was 15, I was already bigger than most of the gang members. They snatched me up early and put my ass to work. Did a lot of things I'm not particularly proud of, but my sister Monique put me back on the right path. I was visiting her up here when all this started. She's the reason I started taking care of people, using my street brawling skills for good." Jarvis swallowed hard. Is she still? She stammered, blushing as she seemed to regret her question. Alive? Zion asked, amused. Yeah, she's alive and kicking. Sorry I didn't get a chance to introduce you. She's helping to get the farms up and going on the south of town. We get through this, and I'll see if I can get her to whip up her sweet potato casserole. Make your taste buds sing. That sounds mouth-wateringly good, Jinx moaned. Can't remember the last time I've had that. Well, she makes it better than anybody who's ever made it for you, Zion declared. No disrespect to your grandma. Jinx raised a palm. None taken. She was a shitty cook, he said. They laughed a bit, enjoying the downtime to chat. But soon enough, the moans grew louder, the waterway getting a little narrower as it rounded a corner. Jarvis took out the map and looked. When we get around this bend, we should look for a place to dock, she said. Straight shot, yes? Jinx asked. She nodded. More or less, she replied. Might have to go down a few blocks to the south, but we're close enough to start looking for dry land. Close enough in my book, Zion agreed. You good with it? Jinx nodded. Sounds good to me, he said. So what's the plan once we land? Jarvis asked. I say we just keep moving, Zion suggested. Jinx shook his head. Not until we get our bearings, he said firmly. If we can get ashore and to shelter without being discovered, we need to do that. Figure out where we need to go. Doesn't matter how fast we move if we end up going in the wrong direction. Yeah, you're right, Zion agreed. Sorry, not often I'm working with someone who's done this so much more than me. The corporal grinned. Well, you crush heads a lot better than me, so we're a good team, he said. Zion chuckled as the group quieted down, knowing that any loud noise from there on out could draw creatures back towards them. They got around the bend, seeing a small boat docked a few 100 yards up on their right. Jinx pointed to it, and the others nodded in agreement. They used the oars to quietly paddle towards the small wooden dock. The boats and yachts that had been stationed there had long since departed for destinations unknown, giving the trio easy access to it. The corporal got there first, hopping up onto the dock and quickly tying up his boat before turning to help the others to dry land. Once they were up on the dock, they stayed motionless and quiet for a moment, listening for noise. The only sound they could hear was the chorus of moans coming from within the city, but nothing sounded particularly close. They looked around to get their bearings, the wooden dock stretching for about 30 yards up to shore, a wooden stairwell taking them about 20 yards up to the boathouse. Jinx led them, his knife at the ready, Zion right behind him with his metal bludgeon, and Jarvis with her knives out, one in each hand. They worked quietly up the stairs, Jinx slowing as he got to the top, peeking up and over towards the building which was about 20 yards from the top step. There were 4 zombies, 3 to the right of the path and 1 to the left. He looked past them, seeing there were ghouls moving in the dim moonlight, but a good 50 yards away at a minimum. Jinx looked at the door, finding it was a half door with the top open, so it was easy to get inside. Jinx turned to the other, giving hand signals for them to take care of the creatures before moving towards the door. They nodded, ready to move. They came up from the stairs, Jarvis moving to the left to take care of the single creature, Zion and Jinx going to the right to tackle the trio. The dim lighting worked to their advantage, allowing them to get close to the enemy without being detected, striking them down before they knew what hit them. The only sound was the cracking of skulls and crumpling on the ground. Jinx looked back to the ghouls in the distance that he spotted, making sure they didn't notice the battle they'd just had. Once he was satisfied that they weren't noticed, he motioned for the others to follow him to the building. He reached the door, looking over to make sure there weren't any hidden ghouls. He reached through the open top portion, opening the bottom and heading in, pulling his flashlight and shining it against his body to keep it dim but give him enough light to see around him. The boathouse had a small restaurant and a shop in the front, and it was very big. There were about 8 tables to their right and a handful of racks on the left. The entire front of the store was glass, the moonlight showing numerous zombies outside, milling about and not paying attention. Jinx checked the couple of back rooms there were, the kitchen and the main office before clicking off the light, relieved that they were alone. He motioned for them to go into the back office, which didn't have a window. He clicked on the flashlight, setting it on the table facing up so that there was light in there. "Okay, look around for anything that can tell us exactly where we are," he said. The group started looking in the small office, Jinx going through the desk, Zion and Jarvis rifling through the various stacks of papers on tables and cabinets. Jinx pulled out a stack of bills, seeing the address. "Okay, got something," Jinx said quietly. "We're at 342 Madison. Jarvis, does your map have roads?" She nodded, spreading out the map and looking it over. On the expanded side they had been using before flipping it over, it revealed a zoomed-in map of downtown Portland. She scanned her finger along the river, finding about where they were and looking for the street, pointing to it when she found it. "Got it," she said, and looked for the hospital, grabbing a pen off of the desk and circling it. Everybody stood back, looking at the map and shaking their heads. "Yeah, that's a hell of a run," Zion murmured, tracing the route 5 blocks to the west and 3 blocks north. "Do we have any idea what is in this area?" "No clue," Jarvis admitted. "The map doesn't say." Jinx snapped his fingers. "I got something that might help," he said, and opened one of the desk drawers, pulling out a handful of takeout menus. He tossed them on the table, and the other 2 blinked down at the pamphlets, confused. "You hungry there, Jinx?" Jarvis asked dryly. "A little, but that's not what this is," the corporal said, tapping on the menus. "If they have takeout menus, which means they're close by, find them on the map." "And we can see if they're in a business area," Jarvis finished, nodding. "Neighborhoods are definitely going to be easier to get through, if we can find them," Zion added. Jarvis pulled a menu over towards her, looking at the address on the front and finding it on the map. She grabbed the next one, finding that, and made it 4 deep, making marks due west of them. She stopped, all of the marks in the same 3-square block radius. "Safe to say that's a business district," she said, circling the area with her finger. She pointed to the southwest of their position, which was due east of the hospital. "I say we go through here. Can't say for certain it's residential, but I know this area isn't. At least, not standalone homes." Jinx leaned over the map, giving it a good once-over. "Okay, we need to get 3 to 4 blocks to the south before turning west," he said. "After that, it's a straight run to the hospital." "Let's go see what we're up against," Zion agreed. The trio moved out of the office and to the front of the building, taking a knee behind some clothing racks for cover. They looked outside, finding light resistance just outside the door. Past that, in the dimly lit streets, it was a little more difficult to see. They could see plenty of movement, just couldn't make out how much. "As soon as any of those things get a whiff on us, it's going to be on," Zion said. Jinx nodded. "Don't worry about fighting. Just push through," he instructed. "Speed is more important than killing." "I can take point," Zion said. Jinx shook his head. "No, I'm going to take point and lead out ahead," he said. Zion cocked a brow. "Little late in the game for you to not trust me, Jinx," he quipped. The corporal shook his head again. "It's not that," he insisted. "I'm trusting you to keep Jarvis safe and clear the way for her. I'm fast enough that I can weave through them. I might get out of sight, but won't be for long, I promise." Zion nodded firmly. "Okay, I got this," he said. "Good, let's get moving," Jinx said, and started to get up before dropping back down to his knee. "Oh, and if you see me running towards you, it means we need to get inside quick." "Comforting," Zion replied, then turned to Jarvis. You stay close to me out there, unless I tell you to duck. If I say that, you need to drop straight to your knees." Jinx smirked. "Out of context. That sounds horrible," he drawled. Jarvis smacked his arm, prompting both men to chuckle. "If I say duck, it means I'm about to swing my big ass-whooping stick," Zion corrected, "and don't want there to be collateral damage." "I know," Jinx said, waving him off. "Just trying to lighten the mood before we do the 5K fun run of the damned." Jarvis rolled her eyes as they got to their feet, and the corporal led them towards the door. He tried it, finding it locked, and reached for the deadbolt, turning it as quietly as he could. Despite that, it clicked open with a loud thunk, and immediately nearby zombies turned towards them. They moaned with intensity as they shambled in their direction, arms outstretched, excited for something to pursue. The zombies behind them made a bunch of noises as well, hungry ghouls shambling with their brethren. "Shit," Jinx muttered. "Come on." He threw open the door and immediately started running. He darted around the few creatures in the parking lot of the building as Zion plowed through them, clearing the way for Jarvis. They ran for about 50 yards, the moans behind them growing in volume, which in turn caused the creatures in front and to the west of them to take notice. Before long, the moaning was so loud that it was masking the sound of their boots on the pavement. They made it a block up without much trouble, Jinx about 10 yards ahead of the others, ducking around outstretched arms as Zion continued to obliterate them. There was a pack of 3 that were pretty close together, and Jinx darted around them, but all of them turned and started shambling towards him. "Duck!" Zion barked, and Jarvis followed his instruction immediately as he stepped forward, swinging and cracking the skulls of 2 of the ghouls standing side by side, sending them careening into the third. "Move!" She leapt to her feet, running back to Zion, the duo jumping over the corpses. Jinx was far ahead of them, about 30 yards, difficult to see in the dim light. All Zion could do was continue to push forward, with the private close behind. Jinx, meanwhile, found an empty patch in between the sea of ghouls. He stopped for a beat to catch his breath, looking up ahead and finding a cross street. 2 more blocks, he huffed under his breath. There were moans all around him, and movement ahead, illuminated by a solar street light in the intersection. He ran towards it, but slowed quickly when ghouls continued to pour into the light. At first it was a dozen, then 2, then a shoulder-to-shoulder sea of corpses. Jinx stood there, looking around, no zombie within 15 yards of him. However, a few were coming from the yard closest to him around the house. He looked in that direction, seeing there was a private fence with an open gate. Jinx looked back to the others as they approached. He let out a whistle, pointing furiously to the fence. Zion saw it and adjusted course, the 3 of them running across the yard towards the gate. Jinx dodged the ghoul closest to him while Zion lowered his shoulder and bowled over the 2 in his way. They made it to the gate, Jinx inside first, seeing 6 zombies in the backyard. They had wandered in at some point, but couldn't find their way out. The noise, however, had shown them the way. "Jarvis, get that gate closed," Jinx instructed. "Zion, on me!" The larger man turned towards the creatures, a large grin spreading across his face. "With pleasure," he said. The 2 of them headed towards the zombies, Jinx drawing his knife and making quick work of a couple of ghouls that were close together. Zion, on the other hand, smacked down ghouls one at a time, bringing his heavy weapon straight down, breaking their neck while cracking skulls. It took several moments, but they were quickly eliminated. The duo walked back to the fence, where Jarvis had shut the wooden privacy fence and secured it. "Well, we made it 1 block before we got trapped," Jinx said brightly. "Guess that qualifies as progress?" Zion smirked. "It's something," he replied. "Come on, let's see what we're up against." They walked to the back of the lot as the moans and banging on the gate got more intense as more zombies approached it. The fence swayed back and forth, not looking very stable. When they reached the back of the lot, they stared at the 7-foot fence. Jinx nodded to Zion, who got down to help boost him up. The corporal made it to the top of the fence, looking over into the yard behind them. It was a fenced-in lot, with chain link instead of wood, and there weren't any zombies he could see inside. However, there were dozens on the road moving towards the commotion at the front of the one they were at. "Okay, we're clear over here," Jinx said. "I'm going to lift you up so you can get over," Zion said. Jinx nodded. "Okay, wait for my signal before sending Jarvis," he replied. "It's dark near the house, and I want to check it out first." "Just hurry. I don't think that fence is going to hold much longer," Zion warned. Jinx moved up higher, grabbing onto the top and flinging himself over. He landed on the ground, stumbling but quickly getting his footing. He pulled his knife, looking keenly towards the house, the tree-lined yard providing dark shadows. He waited several seconds before figuring out he was alone. Jinx reached back and gave him a light tap on the fence to signal the others, then kept a close watch as Jarvis boosted up and over. Zion took several steps back in order to get a running start towards the fence. He looked back when he heard the gate behind him collapse, zombies flooding in. He quickly threw his weapon over the fence. "Heads up!" he barked, and got a running start, leaping just before reaching the fence. He got high enough that he grabbed the top and quickly pulled himself over. He wasn't as graceful as the soldiers, toppling over the side. Jinx was there to sort of break his fall, or at least lessen it, though it pulled them both to the ground. "You good?" the corporal asked. "Yeah, sorry about the weapon toss," Zion replied sheepishly. "That damn gate broke, so I didn't have a lot of time." Jarvis approached, carrying the beastly weapon. "Missed my head by about 6 inches. So, no harm, no foul, I guess?" she asked as she held it out, a mischievous sparkle in her eye. "Sorry about that, girl," Zion replied as he took it. "I'll make it up to you." Jinx waved for them to follow him, and they moved up to the cover of darkness beside the house, looking out towards the intersection of the next block. There were dozens of zombies in the road, with the moans continuing to resonate in the neighborhood. "If you let me lead, I can break us through," Zion offered. "Which way do you want to go?" "We still need to get over 2 more blocks before turning to the west," Jinx explained. "If we go west now, we run the risk of hitting that business district. I want to avoid that if we can. Too few places to hide." "Okay, I'll get us up 2 blocks," Zion promised with a firm nod. "You tell me when to make the turn, because once I get going I kind of lose my bearings. All I see is another enemy to knock down." Jinx returned his nod. "Don't worry, I'll call it out," he said. "Okay, let's get over the fence," Zion said. "You wait on my signal and you give me a few yards of space." Jinx waved for him to go ahead with a flourish. "The show is yours," he said. Zion nodded and the trio quietly made it over to the chain-link fence, taking a knee in the shadows, not ready to let the ghouls know they were there. Jinx and Jarvis nodded to Zion that they were ready, and he got up to take them out. The road and intersection was packed with zombies, easily 100 in their field of view, and God only knew how many in the shadows outside of the streetlight. They weren't tightly packed, but still relatively close. He studied the group, picking his course and preparing to move. He knew he had a couple of people to block for, so he took that into account. He let out a deep breath to steady himself before glancing back. "Here we go," he said, and leapt up, picking up a head of steam. The soldiers seemed caught off guard, running hard to keep up with the large man. Zion targeted the first zombie he saw, lifting it up off of the ground and driving it through several others before throwing it to the side. He paused for a brief second, letting the soldiers catch up to him. "Stay on my ass!" he barked, and took off running as every creature within 50 yards immediately began to descend on them. Zion was undeterred, clearing the path like a professional football player. Zombies flew off to the side as he shoved them like rag dolls. They ran through the intersection, making it to the road, which was tree-covered and more difficult to see the enemy. It did work in their favor too, as the zombies couldn't see them as well either. Zion continued to clear the way, pumping his legs hard and shoving ghoul after ghoul away. When he started to slow down a bit, he put his metal weapon in front of him to help shoulder some of the work. Zion glanced back, seeing that Jinx and Jarvis were still behind him by a few yards. The moans behind them continued to pick up, keeping him motivated to push forward. As he got closer to the intersection, he was forced to stop, because the mob that was in the streetlight's view was too dense. Shoulder to shoulder, a couple hundred of them, easy. He looked to the west, hoping to be able to cut across the yard and hit the next street, but those hopes were dashed. Hundreds of zombies stood in the road over there as well, like a giant mob had been working their way towards the river and just ended up in the neighborhood together. "Jinx!" Zion hissed. The corporal came up beside him, looking at the situation and immediately whirling towards the house beside them. "Get into the house!" he cried, and they didn't hesitate, rushing towards the front door as the zombies from the road started coming towards them. Jinx ran straight up to the door, trying to get it open, but it was locked up tight. The windows had bars on them, so that was a no-go. He turned around just in time to see a flood of ghouls coming off of the road, including the ones that had been following them. There was no way to push through. "Door's locked!" he cried. Zion summoned up every bit of anger and intensity he could, turning back towards the door. He handed Jinx his weapon, speaking matter-of-factly. "Keep 'em off me," he said. Jinx ran forward, swinging the weapon at a few of the zombies that had been breaking away from the pack, knocking them to the ground, but unfortunately not killing them. The corporal unfortunately didn't have the upper body strength to wield the weapon to its utmost effectiveness, but he could at least delay their advances. Zion made it to the front door, delivering several forceful front kicks to where the locking mechanism was. The first few kicks broke the doorframe, and he continued to give kick after kick, not stopping. Several grunts and screams later, the door snapped open beneath his assault. "We're in!" he barked. Jinx swung one more time, hitting a few more as he ran back, getting through the door just as the zombies reached the front porch. Zion slammed the door shut, at least as far as it would go. He put his entire body weight against it to hold it shut. "This isn't gonna hold long, so whatever you're gonna do, you better do it quick," he cried. "Jarvis, cover me," Jinx immediately said. "We might not be alone in here." "On it," she replied, quickly sweeping the hallway leading to the bedrooms, slamming the doors to make sure if they weren't alone that they wouldn't be bothered. Jinx, meanwhile, headed into the kitchen, looking out through the back door. There were a couple dozen zombies in the backyard, but spread out, headed their way. Past them was a yard with a chain-link fence with no zombies he could see. Jinx frantically looked around the kitchen, trying to come up with an idea to get them out of it. Then he spotted it, the gas stove. He ran over to the cabinets, throwing them open and looking through them. Come on, he huffed to himself. "Gotcha!" He finally found a bottle of whiskey and yanked it from the shelf. "Zion, we're out of here in 30 seconds, he called. Jarvis came running back to the kitchen, skidding to a stop as Jinx headed over to the gas stove with the bottle in his hands. "Aw, shit," she said. "I know, scold me later," he replied. "Pull the table away from the sliding glass door and put it up against the wall." He held out the bottle. "Pour this on it." She knew she was going on and immediately following his instructions. As she did, Jinx blew out the pilot light and turned the knobs on the stove to get the gas flowing. 15 seconds, he bellowed, and ran over to the sliding glass door, which had a few zombies by it with more on the way a few yards behind. Jinx raised up Zion's weapon as if he were a jouster. "When I tell you to, open that sliding glass door and follow me out," he instructed. "Got it," Jarvis replied with a firm nod. Jinx pulled out his lighter and set the table ablaze. "We're moving," he called. "Ignore the fire." "What fire?" Zion cried from the front door, sounding concerned. "Just move," Jinx barked. "Jarvis, now!" She pulled open the door and Jinx started running, using the weapon to slam into the few creatures right at the opening, pushing them back into the yard and giving them a path. Jarvis was out next, narrowly avoiding the grasp of the ghouls, making it into the yard where there was some room to maneuver. Zion broke away from the door, barely avoiding being tripped up by it flinging open. He sprinted into the kitchen, seeing the flaming table but paying it no attention. He lowered his shoulder and barreled through the creature at the door before getting into the yard. He saw the soldiers were halfway across the yard and headed towards the street, as well as zombies coming at them from every direction. He started sprinting towards them. "On your six!" he cried. Jinx spotted him and tossed the weapon in the air, which Zion caught as he rushed towards the few ghouls ahead of them. He smashed them out of the way, clearing the path for them to get to the fence. They ran and jumped over, with Jinx taking the lead and sprinting up to the front door. It was locked, but the window wasn't covered with bars. "Zion! Window!" he yelled. "Hurry!" Zion didn't ask why, simply running up and smashing the glass, clearing it out. As soon as it was safe, Jinx leapt inside. "I'll clear it! Get inside!" he urged, then disappeared into the building. Zion helped Jarvis up, shaking his head. "What's he in such a hurry for?" he asked. "He turned on the gas back there," the private explained. He was confused for a split second, before he remembered the table that was on fire. "The boy did what?" he gasped as he clambered in after her. Jinx was in the kitchen at the back door, looking out towards the next street and house. There weren't many zombies between them and the next one, which had an open garage door. "Come on, we gotta move," Jinx barked. "You're about to blow up a house?" Zion demanded. "Yep," the corporal replied. "What happened to being stealthy?" Zion asked, cocking a brow. Jinx shrugged. "This is stealthy," he replied. "Come on, we gotta get across the street to that house. We're too close to the other one." "Shit," Zion muttered, and threw open the door, leading the charge outside. They raced across the yard, and the zombies were far enough apart that they were able to miss them entirely. They made it to the open garage door, Zion turning and grabbing it, pulling down on it hard. He had enough strength to break the auto mechanism, sending the door crashing to the ground. Jinx made it to the door, opening it up and entering with his knife at the ready. "We gotta clear this place, quickly," he said, "and stay away from the windows." "Got it," Jarvis replied, and the two of them moved through the house, finding it completely devoid of anything moving. "Clear," she called. "Same," Jinx replied. The trio met in the living room, but Jinx pulled them into a small bedroom that only had one small window facing away from the house that was about to go boom. They were all out of breath, leaning over and struggling to catch it. "So, this is stealthy, huh?" Zion huffed. Jinx nodded. "It will be once that goes off," he said. "I'd love to hear how you think blowing up a goddamn house is stealthy," Zion said, shaking his head. "Because we were never going to make it to the hospital with that kind of crowd to fight through," the corporal explained, waving a hand. "So I decided to do something about the mob." "When that thing goes off, it's going to pull God only knows how many thousands of those things our way," Zion protested. Jinx held up a finger. "No, it's going to pull thousands of those things towards the house that's a block and a half back," he corrected. "If we stay here, stay out of sight and stay quiet, a lot of those things are going to pass us by," he grinned. "See? Stealthy." Zion rubbed his forehead, shaking his head. "You're a crazy son of a bitch, Jinx," he said, unable to keep from smiling. A giant boom rattled the windows, shaking the house. Zion looked up. "But you're a man with a plan," he added. "More like a maniac with a plan," Jarvis added. "Thank you," Jinx declared with a proud grin. "Not sure if that was a compliment," Zion quipped. "Oh, it was," Jarvis said, laughing and shaking her head. "He revels in it." Jinx checked his watch. "Almost 1 in the morning," he said. "Let's give it an hour or so, see what we're dealing with outside." "I'll check the pantry," Jarvis said. "Just watch those windows," the corporal reminded her. She smirked. "Not my first rodeo, Jinx," she said. He gave her a playful thumbs up, knowing she was right. "You really think on your feet, don't you?" Zion asked, reclining a bit once she was gone. "That was a ballsy move to blow up a house." Jinx shrugged. Not the first one I've blown up since all this started," he admitted. "Or blown up this week. Or hell, blown up in the last 36 hours or so." Zion laughed, then feigned an infomercial voice. "Jinx's home demolition," he declared. "It'll be loud and messy, but he works for free because the explosion is all the pay he needs." Jinx laughed. "We survived this and I'm hiring you as a hype man," he said. The two men settled in and got comfortable as they waited for the zombies to march by them. Chapter 2. 2 hours had passed since the house detonated. The sky was still illuminated by the fires burning. Jinx and Zion were firmly planted on the couch, stretching out and getting some much-needed rest. Jarvis sat by the window, looking back towards the destruction. "I think another house caught fire," she murmured. "The sky to the right just got brighter." "Amazing how you can take out an entire block in the span of 30 seconds, Zion quipped. "Funny thing is, that's not even my record," Jinx replied. Jarvis held up a finger. "This is your personal record," she corrected. "You had help with that mini-mall." "Not much help," Jinx said petulantly. "Not much?" she demanded incredulously. "I had to fight off a 300-pound zombie chef who has been baking over a month because when he keeled over, he left the oven on. You damn well better be giving me credit." Zion nodded slowly. "Half-baked zombie chef?" he drawled. "Yeah, man, you'd better give her some credit." "Okay, fine," Jinx admitted, drawing out the word. "This was my personal record. Still, 30 seconds for a neighborhood street is pretty quick." "I mean, I'd be proud," Zion said. "Well, we still have time, and you got a bag full of explosive devices," the corporal said with a smirk. "Long day ahead of us, too." Zion sat up. "Speaking of, how's it looking out there?" he asked. "The flow of those things has slowed down over the last 20 minutes or so," Jarvis reported from the window. "Seen maybe 40 or so go by in that span. They're getting pretty packed in on the road, too. Can almost see the back end of the line." "Guess we should check the back," Jinx said, and got up from the couch with a long stretch and groan. Zion did a series of arm and shoulder stretches as he followed him into the kitchen, and the two of them stood behind the closed blinds, peeking out. There were about 20 zombies milling about, some of which weren't even walking towards the flaming rubble that was a house. "Well, Jinx, unless you want to blow up another house," Zion drawled, "I think we've reached the end of that distraction." "Yeah, they do look like they've lost interest," he agreed, and checked his watch. "Damn near 3 in the morning. If we're going to make that noon deadline, we should get moving." Zion held up a hand. "Hang on. Got an idea," he said, and headed to the side bedroom, looking out. The moonlight wasn't the brightest, but he could see the yards across the street in the direction they needed to go. "Why don't we go this way?" he suggested. "Stay off the road. I know it's a little more dangerous given how dark it is, but might be a better option, at least for a few blocks." "That's not a bad idea," Jinx agreed. "Last thing we need is to have our footsteps pull that flood of zombies back towards us." He raised his voice a touch. "All right, Jarvis, let's get a move on." Everybody geared up, grabbing their weapons and their bags of explosives. They stood by the back door looking out. There wasn't a single zombie in the backyard, and the closest one on the road was about 30 yards away. "Okay, we're going to move quietly against the wall. Stay in the shadows as long as we can," Jinx instructed. "When I give the signal, we're going to walk across the street, but quick mall walker style. No hard footsteps. We'll have a few that follow, but the noise they make will blend in with all that mess down the street. As soon as we hit grass, though, we book it. Just keep your eyes peeled, because it's dark. Everybody good?" Both of them nodded, and Jinx unlatched the sliding door as quietly as he could, before doing the same as he opened it. He nodded as he led the trio outside, staying close to the wall, taking gentle steps on the back patio before making it to the grass. They snuck up the side of the house, stopping at the edge. They looked across the street, seeing only a handful of creatures, none of which were within 15 yards of them. He nodded, and they headed out. They walked quickly and quietly across the pavement. A couple of ghouls noticed them, turning and moaning as they shambled towards the soldiers and Zion. The trio paid them no attention, just doing their best to stay quiet as they got to the grass and picking up the pace. It was extremely dark, so dark that Jinx held them up, pulling out his flashlight and clicking it on for a brief second, before clicking it back off. It was a risky move, but he didn't have any choice. In that brief moment he could tell that the path to the next yard, which had a fence, was clear. They moved to it, hopping over and taking their time going to the next yard. The moon shone brightly over the next few yards with no trees, and the path was mostly clear, just a few stragglers spread out. The group continued on their path, stabbing the offending ghouls as they went and tossing them to the side. Just another day at the office. It took a little while, but they finally made it a couple blocks up and were ready to make the turn to the west. The final yard they were in was fenced in, with no creatures in the back. They went up to the back sliding patio door, which, to their amazement, was unlocked. They went inside, quickly clearing the house before regrouping in the living room, which looked straight ahead at the road that led to the hospital. They were close enough that they could see the streetlights in the parking lot, no more than 2 blocks up. The light also allowed them to see the mass of ghouls out front, a couple hundred at least. "It always this hard with you?" Zion asked. Jinx shrugged. You get used to it," he said. "How we pulling this off to get inside?" Zion asked. "Getting inside is only half the problem," Jarvis pointed out. "We still have to get back out, before those bombs go off. If we just make a run for it through them, then we're going to be trapped inside." Jinx thought for a moment, getting an idea and pulling out one of the explosive devices. He studied the timer on it, noticing that he could punch in hours if he wanted to. "Well, I know how we're getting out," he said, holding up the bomb. "We'll get one of these to go off at 11. That'll buy us 30 minutes or so for that to pull them away from the hospital, and give us 30 minutes to get the hell away from the hospital before it blows." "That's a hell of a tight window," Jarvis said dryly. "If we set it off too early, then they might just wander on back," Jinx said. "Set it off too late, and we don't have time to get away." Zion nodded. "Where are we setting it off?" he asked. Jinx thought for a moment, then held his hand out to Jarvis. "Let me see that map for a second," he prompted. She handed it over, and he spread out the map, tracing his finger along the route they'd taken. He found the house they'd blown up, and where they were standing now. "We're going to do it a block or so back, towards the way we came," the corporal said. "Set it up in a house there and pull them that way, so if any of them from the first house come up, we can avoid them." Zion shrugged. "Hell, why don't we just set one off now to pull those things away from the hospital and have the longer timer one?" he suggested. "Guess we could do the house-sitting trick again," Jinx agreed. "Jarvis?" She nodded. "I'm game," she agreed. "If it ain't broke, don't fix it," the corporal quipped. "I like it." They took another look out the front of the house, finding only a handful of ghouls directly in front of them, the majority of the mob up near the hospital. "Follow me," Jinx murmured, and led them out. They ran towards the street, Zion stepping up and cracking a skull just to keep himself warmed up. A few creatures followed them, but they didn't worry about it too much. their only concern to get as close to the hospital as they could without being detected by the large mob. They ran through the yards in between a couple of houses, the moonlight providing enough for them to see. Finally, they were at the target house, one on the corner that faced the hospital. There were 2 creatures in the backyard that Jinx and Jarvis took out with knives, dropping them silently to the ground. Zion went up to the back door, turning the knob and finding it locked. He elbowed the small window panel by the lock, shattering the glass and reaching inside. He quickly unlocked it and opened the door, only to be greeted by a shambling corpse. It caught him off guard, but he reacted quickly, grabbing it by the throat and pinning it against the doorframe. Before he had a chance to take it out, Jarvis was there with a knife to the side of its head. He looked at her, giving a nod and a playful wink, prompting a smile from her. He set the ghoul in the grass as Jinx led them inside. They did a quick sweep of the house, finding they were finally alone. They went to the front of the house, looking out towards the hospital at a mob of zombies. "That looks fun," Jinx quipped. "Looks like easy access, too," Jarvis added, pointing to the emergency room doors that were wide open, broken off of their hinges like a group of people had tried to run out when things went south. "Now we just gotta pull them away," Jinx said, and set down his bag, going through it and pulling out 2 devices. He looked at his watch, setting the timer on one to go off at 11. He put that one in his pocket and started to put in a timer on the other one, but stopped. "Not going to box myself in," he said. "Don't know what I'm up against yet." He put it in his other pocket. "Okay, I want you 2 to be ready to move when I get back." "Wait, when you get back?" Zion demanded. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" "Gonna go drop these off," Jinx replied. "It's a quick out and back." Zion glared at him, easily inferring the unspoken question of, "Are you for real?" "Don't worry, he does this all the time," Jarvis piped up. "He'll be fine." "Yeah, what she said," Jinx echoed, jerking his thumb in her direction. Zion glowered at him. "Damn well better be," he muttered. "Hang tight, I'll be right back," the corporal said, and worked his way to the back of the house, peeking outside before exiting. He moved swiftly to the north, away from the hospital and back in the direction they'd come. There were a few ghouls in the next yard, spread out fairly well. Jinx sighed. "Either take them out now or deal with them later," he thought, and drew his knife. He stabbed the first one, letting it fall over in the grass, casually walking up to the next one and doing the same. The final zombie was about 10 yards away, but it was caught up on something that he couldn't quite make out, but it was slowing it down. He stood there for a moment, watching as the creature struggled to walk towards him, its legs flailing about. Finally, it fell face first into the grass, landing hard. All Jinx could do was chuckle as he drove his knife into the back of its head. "If only you were all that easy," he murmured before making his way to the end of the block. He took a moment in the shadows of a house to scan the area. There were 30 or so ghouls to his left, 10 to his right, and only a few directly in his path. Across the street were several houses, one of which he knew he had to get to in order to set the 11 o'clock device. He readied his knife, preparing to run out from the shadows to the house, plotting his course around the back. Finally, he pounced, running through the grass towards the ghouls that were in his path. He adjusted his course so that he blew right by them, confusing the creatures, as they likely hadn't seen anything move that fast in ages. Immediately, they turned and moaned, shambling after him, their sounds attracting the others. Jinx knew he didn't have long before things were going to get hairy, so he ran to the back door, which was luckily a standard door. He didn't try the handle, just broke out the glass by stabbing it, reaching in and opening it from the inside. He didn't bother shutting the door, because he was only in there for a moment. He ran to the gas stove, blowing out the pilot light and turning on the gas, just not at full blast. He set the bomb next to the stove, turning and running out of the house and shutting the door behind him. He made it to the backyard just as the ghouls that had been following him were turning the corner of the house. They immediately spotted him, moaning as they pursued him. Jinx started running back towards them, staying in the middle of the yard, well out of reach. He made it 2 doors down, encountering no more ghouls in the yards. He paused, looking back and seeing more creatures filing towards him. Jinx ran to the back of a house, looking out towards the road and spotting a couple dozen ghouls wandering around, a few of which were noticing the noise of the pursuing mob. "Okay, they're spread out enough. You can get through that," Jinx said. "Then what, though?" He looked around past them, spotting his salvation, a treehouse. "Get to be a kid again," he said with a big grin. He set the timer on the secondary device for 5 minutes, tossing it back into the yard before running towards the treehouse. As soon as he came around the corner of the house, the zombies in the road took notice. He didn't waste time fighting, just darting around their outstretched arms, running towards the treehouse, which was shrouded in a bit of darkness. He made it to the wooden ladder, nailed into the tree itself, and climbed up quickly, diving inside. He peeked out through the hole in the wall that acted like a window, watching several of the zombies that had been following him. They were looking around, as if trying to figure out where he'd gone. Jinx breathed a sigh of relief, looking around his home for the next little bit, the moon coming in through the window providing a bit of light. There were some books in the corner, and he picked them up. As he did, a magazine fell out of the center of one, and he chuckled at the sight of a naked woman on the cover. "Whoever you are, kid, just know you had good taste," he thought, and flipped through the magazine, checking out the models that were most likely long gone from the earth. He was happy to have something pleasant to pass the time while waiting for the diversion to start. A few minutes later, he got his wish. The bomb went off in the distance, and it was a loud one, sending his ears ringing. He shook his head. "All right, Fingers, you know what you're doing," he said, and set down the magazine, glancing out and watching the zombies that had been coming after him wander back to investigate the noise. "Few more minutes. Should be in the clear," he thought, and settled back in with the magazine and a broad smile on his face. Chapter 3. Jinx walked through the backyards of the houses, working his way back to the others. He paused at the edge of the last house before his target, looking out towards the road. There were dozens of ghouls walking by, heading towards the sound of the explosion from earlier. He smirked, proud of the work he'd done. He snuck across the space between houses, moving slowly so that if a zombie did look over and notice, they might not figure he was alive. He got to the other side, peeking back, relieved that he hadn't attracted any attention. "Would have sucked to have lost the ruse at this point," he thought as he slipped into the house, gently closing the door behind him. He let out a soft whistle, letting the others know he was back, and to make sure he wasn't beaten down by mistake. He made it into the living room, where they stood, watching out the window. "How's it looking out there?" he asked. "We're getting there," Zion replied. "Couple more minutes and we should be good to go." Jinx looked out, seeing that 90% of the ghouls had wandered away, attracted by the blast. The zombies that did remain were spread out, some caught up on cars with a batch focused intently on a vehicle at the far end of the lot. "Must have had a live one in there," Jinx said. "Yeah, we thought that too," Jarvis agreed. "As long as we don't make too much noise going in, we should be fine." Zion crossed his arms. "So, are we set?" he asked. Jinx nodded. "Yep, we have a little less than 7 hours to get into the hospital, find the basement, set the charges, and get the hell out," he said. "It's a huge-ass place, probably not too much access to the basement," Zion pointed out. "Don't want random people wandering down there." Jarvis nodded. "We checked the emergency stairwells first," she said.
Doesn't matter how secure it is down there. They have to have ways out in an emergency." She paused, thinking. "How are we going to get through the doors, though? If it's protected, and emergency doors, wouldn't they only open from the inside?"
"She's got a point," Zion said dryly. "Okay, well, emergency stairwells are secondary," Jinx said. "There has to be some sort of access." "Elevators?" Zion suggested. The corporal shook his head. "Only if the car is at the bottom of the shaft," he said. "Not like we can hit a button and ride it down."
"Then we need to find the maintenance office," Jarvis said firmly. "If anybody is going to have the map and blueprints of the facility, it'll be them."
Jinx nodded. "Good thing we have plenty of time, huh?" he asked with a grin. "I think we're looking as good as we're going to get out there," Zion piped up. They looked out, seeing the ghouls were mostly spread out, with about 30 standing between them and the open ER doors. The dozen or so around the car continued to focus on whatever was inside the vehicle. "Let's do it," Jinx said, and led them to the front door, throwing it open and rushing into the front yard. They moved quickly across the grass, slowing down on the pavement to minimize the noise. They looked back towards the direction the mob was marching, the tail end of them a block away and paying them no attention. A few in the front did notice, however, moaning with delight at the presence of free-range meals. They started coming their way, and Zion stepped up to start dealing with them. A few choice swings and 3 of them were down for the count. Jinx and Jarvis came around Zion, moving on to another group of 4. They shoved the outside zombies back in towards the other 2, stabbing and shoving the lifeless corpses. This bought them an opening to finish the job on the other 4. They moved across the rest of the parking lot, taking turns smacking down all comers, not concerned in the least outside of making too much noise. It took a couple of minutes of sustained carnage, but finally they were at the front doors. They stopped at the threshold, the interior of the hospital extremely dark, the emergency lighting not working in the ER waiting area. Jinx pulled out his flashlight, shining it inside. Everybody just shook their heads at the sight. "Looks like a clusterfuck if I ever saw one," Zion said. There were bodies and blood everywhere, tables and chairs overturned. It was a war zone without the bullet holes. Jinx shook off the vision, looking to the doors, nodding when he saw they weren't broken, just knocked off their tracks. "Grab that other one," Jinx instructed. Jarvis yanked it back into position, onto its track. They stepped past the threshold, pushing them together. Jinx reached down to lock it, shaking his head when he couldn't find one. "All right, ERs don't close," he muttered. "Still, if any stragglers come up, I doubt they'll be able to figure out how to get inside." "Little protection's better than none," Zion said. Jarvis pulled out a flashlight as well, the 3 of them walking inside, taking care not to step in the various blood pools on the ground, long-dried, but still nasty. They also kicked the corpses on the ground, making sure they were indeed dead. Most of them had been devoured, like a swarm of creatures had come over them and left nothing behind. The main ER doors were ahead, which led to a long hallway and back to some offices. Jinx went up to it, shining his light through the windows, finding more carnage and darkness. "Shit," he muttered. "What is it?" Jarvis asked. "I got movement," he replied. She joined him at the door, shining her light through as well. There were several shambling figures in the darkness, not paying the light much attention. The office doors on either side of the hallway were open too. "Check the reception areas," he instructed. Jarvis went one way and Zion the other, looking through the glass into the reception offices, finding nothing but more signs of carnage. "We're good," Zion said. "Okay, let's get back there and clear them out," Jinx declared, and pushed open the doors. The trio made sure to shut them gently behind them, not wanting the ghouls to know they were in the room until they were good and ready. They crept down the hallway, knives and bludgeons at the ready. They got to the opening into the main ER, where half a dozen creatures ambled around. As they prepared to fight, Jinx looked to his left, finding a wheeled gurney. He grabbed it and rolled it in front of them, blocking off most of the hallway. Zion cocked a brow and shot him a glance. Jinx shrugged. "Work smarter, not harder," he asked. Zion smirked before clanking his weapon on the ground a few times to get the attention of the creatures ahead. The pack slowly worked their way towards the humans, one by one pressing up against the bed, not able to reach their intended prey. A few stabs and they were down, and a few minutes later the room was clear. Jinx shoved the bed out of the way, and they moved forward to inspect the ER. There were 3 doors leading out of the main area, one to either side and one straight ahead. "So, what do we want?" the corporal asked, feigning a game show announcer voice. "Door number 1, door number 2, or door number 3?
"This building is huge," Jarvis pointed out. "I say we start in the center and work our way out."
Jinx cocked his head towards her.
"Any particular reason?" he asked. She shrugged. "Maintenance is probably in the middle," she explained. "If something goes wrong, they don't want to be running from one side of the building to the other."
"Good enough logic for me," Zion agreed. "Let's do it." Jinx nodded, and they walked over to the center door, looking through the window, the emergency lighting having failed here too, completely dark in the hallway. They shone the lights down, seeing some blood but no corpses, alive or dead. "Let's go," Jinx said. He led the way, holding his flashlight along with his knife, ready to strike at anything that came his way. The corridor was wide, so that 2 stretchers could pass each other. There were doors on either side of the hallway, most of them closed. The first batch they passed had numbers on them, looking just like patient rooms. Jinx wanted to make sure, opening one a crack. As soon as he did, a moan echoed from inside, and he slammed it shut, glancing at the others. "Guessing that one is occupied," he said. Jarvis shook her head as they kept working their way down the hallway. Finally, they made it to some offices, shining the lights inside and finding no creatures. "Let's check it out," he instructed. They went inside, looking on the walls and on desks, hoping to find anything that might be useful. After several minutes of rummaging, they came out, and the only person smiling was Jarvis. "Got something that might help," she said, and waved for them to follow her into the big office. She pointed to the wall, where there was a large layout of the entire hospital, with instructions for firefighters on it. "Maintenance is on level 3, and we can take the stairs up at the end of the hall." "Anything on the tanks?" Jinx asked as he looked it over. Jarvis pointed to an area labeled Storage, which had a lock icon on it, as well as a flame. "Maybe this? Nothing else on the map screams oxygen tanks," she said. "The flame I get, but what's the lock for?" Zion asked. "Secure room, maybe?" she suggested with a shrug. "Letting them know that they're going to need a key to get in?" "Let's hope that maintenance has some blueprints and a way back in," Zion said. "Worst case, we can always blow the door." Jinx shook his head. "Hopefully it won't come to that since we'd risk igniting everything," he reminded them. "Okay, 3rd floor it is," Zion said. They got back out into the hallway, moving slowly, hearing moans coming from in front of them, echoing through the cavernous corridor. They made it to the end of the hallway, looking to either side and spotting movement about 30 or 40 yards away. They weren't paying them any attention, so the group ignored them, opening the door to the stairwell. As soon as Jinx pulled on the handle, the door flew open, several zombies on the other side reacting to it moving. Zion grabbed Jinx by the collar and yanked him back with such force that he landed on the ground, sliding to the floor. He didn't waste time, taking advantage of the fallen ghouls driving the top of his weapon into their skulls like he was trying to break ground with a shovel. He took out most of them, with a couple sitting back up and shambling back into the stairwell, stumbling to regain its footing. He looked past them, seeing that there was a concrete wall behind them. He drove forward, putting the weapon into the lead creature's chest, pinning them against the wall. Jarvis leapt over the fallen ghouls, delivering knife strikes to the creatures and dropping them. They immediately turned their attention to the stairs to their right, hearing footsteps and moans above them. There weren't that many, but it was enough to put them on edge. "Jinx, you good?" Zion asked. The corporal nodded. "Yeah, thanks for the assist," he said. "Can't have you dying on me," Zion quipped with a smile. They shone the flashlights up the stairs, hearing movement directly above them. As they started ascending, there was a commotion, like something was falling. A sickening crunch echoed as a ghoul fell down the stairs, ending up on the landing in a mangled mess. Zion stabbed it in the head to put it out of its misery. "We're going to have to clear this whole thing," Jinx said. "I don't want to be surprised if we have to come back in a hurry." The group moved up slowly, making some whistles as they went, hoping to attract the creatures and get them to trip over the stairs in the darkness. Several creatures above them stumbled, breaking bones on their way down the stairs. Finally, they made it up to the 5th and final floor landing, looking up and seeing 3 ghouls standing there, trying to get into the door. The trio stood there, staring. "I thought we were more interesting than a door," Jinx said, sounding almost petulant. "Let me ring the dinner bell," Zion said, and smacked his weapon against the ground a few times, sending a metallic sound through the air and getting their attention. The zombies were excited, turning around and rushing towards them. Their legs got tangled up, falling down the stairs as a single unit, flipping over and crashing into the landing where the trio had stepped back. "If you'd like to do the honors," Jinx offered with a flourish. Zion grinned. "With pleasure," he said, and cracked the 3 in their skulls before they could even attempt to get back up. With the threat neutralized, they worked their way back down to the 3rd floor, taking a beat before they opened the door. Jinx pulled it towards him, this time putting his foot next to it so he wasn't overrun again. To his delight, there wasn't anything on the other side. He motioned for the others to follow him. This floor looked like a war zone, with blood and bodies everywhere. To their left were a couple of overturned gurneys, an attempt to hold up an attacking mob. Unfortunately, one side had been pushed away from the wall, so the ghouls they were holding at bay had been able to get through. Jinx let his curiosity get to him, walking over and shining the light onto the other side. And it was horrific. There were a few bodies on the ground, with various objects sticking out of their heads. The entire floor was painted a dark red, with entrails and other body innards spread around. He shook his head and went back to the others. "We have to assume they're still up here with us," Jinx said. "Stay sharp." Jarvis pointed in the opposite direction. "According to the map, the maintenance office is this way," she said. "Should be a door that cuts through the center of the floor that takes us to it. Back of the building." "I'll take point. Just keep that flashlight pointed ahead," Zion said. Jarvis nodded, taking up position behind Zion. They worked through the eerily quiet floor, carnage all around them, but with nothing moving. They made it to the hallway that cut to the back of the building, walking slowly, looking each way and checking to make sure the doors were closed. They made it to an intersection, with hallways going on either side, but nothing moved in them either. They made it to the end, looking to the left but quickly pulling back, because there was a mob of ghouls in front of a door, banging and moaning. Jinx took point, looking back at the mob, seeing there were 30 or so of them around the door, banging and not letting up. They talked quietly. "That's the maintenance room, isn't it?" he asked softly. Jarvis nodded. Zion sighed. "That's a hell of a fight," he murmured. "Maybe we can get some of those gurney things, set up our own barricade," Jinx asked. Didn't work out so well the last time, Zion reminded him. As they debated, Jarvis looked up at the wall, finding the emergency exit map. She traced her finger along it, seeing that the hallway they'd just passed cut to the back of the building, but on the other side of the ghouls.
I got this, she whispered.
You got what? Zion asked. She waved their attention towards the map.
Look, the hallway goes to the other side, she explained. I flank them and pull them away from the door, as many as I can at any rate. That should clear the way for you to get inside.
Jinx furrowed his brow. You sure? He asked.
You need a diversion, and that's why I'm here, she replied firmly. I'll get them moving. You get in, find whatever we need, and get out. Meet back at the stairwell? Just try not to linger, because those things will be following me. Don't want them to cut off the entrance to the stairwell.
We'll be in and out before you know it, Jinx assured her. Be safe, Zion said. Jarvis nodded before she started backtracking to the hallway. She made the turn, shining the flashlight down the curved corridor. She moved quickly down it, keeping her noise as low as possible, pausing as she came around a bend. There were two creatures in the hall shambling about, facing her. They weren't interested in anything in particular, just moving around in the dark, lost in what was certainly a maze of them. Jarvis laid her flashlight on the ground, aiming it towards them, which got their attention. She darted out, using her knife to stab the first one in the head before ducking underneath the grasp of the second, popping up behind it and dropping it to the ground. As she did, a noise came from the open room beside her, and she took a step back as another zombie came out, this one missing several chunks of flesh and dressed in a bloody hospital gown. She looked at the poor thing, what had once been a woman in her mid-50s, with an IV still in her arm, the pole squeaking against the floor behind it.
Poor woman. Never had a chance,
Jarvis thought before she stepped up and drove her knife into the creature's skull, ending its miserable existence. She moved back, grabbing her flashlight and headed on, pausing as she passed the door. She shone the light in, finding a bed on wheels, which gave her an idea. She quickly dragged the corpse away from the door and moved in cautiously to make sure she was alone. She grabbed the bed and rolled it out into the hallway, taking a moment to find the locking mechanism for the wheels. When she located it, she locked it down so that the bed wouldn't move. There was a narrow alleyway alongside one of the walls, but for the most part, it was blocking the hallway.
Not going to stop them for very long, but should buy us a few extra minutes, she thought. Every little bit helps.
Jarvis continued on, making it to the end of the hallway, the sound of banging and moaning growing as she moved. She stopped at the edge of the hallway, looking down and seeing the mob about 20 yards away, still intently focused on the door. She checked the other direction, making sure nothing was down that way, and it was clear. Jarvis took a deep breath, steadying herself before letting out a rebel yell that would have made even the most seasoned hair metal singer proud. Her vocals resonated through the hallway, highlighted by her use of the flashlight, shining onto the creatures and herself.
"Yeah, I'm over here," she bellowed. "Come and get me!"
She let out a laugh, making any noise she could to draw them towards her. It didn't take long for the ghouls to come her way, breaking away from the door and sauntering across the floor in an excited manner. The mob was a mixture of patients, doctors, nurses, and civilians. Jarvis looked at them, realizing that these things had been trapped in this building since the apocalypse began.
"Well, that explains the smell," she muttered, and backed up, glancing over her shoulder to make sure there were no surprises. She continued to make noise, trying to make sure the ones in the back stayed interested in her. Finally, once the majority of them were around the bend, she turned and ran back to the bed, sliding through the narrow opening and making it to the other side. She stood there, watching for several moments,
continuing to make noise to keep the attention on her.
"Hope that worked, Jinx," she whispered. "Go get him."
Meanwhile, Jinx and Zion watched the mob move away from the door, every last one of them shambling off to chase Jarvis. The duo stood there silently, only occasionally looking in the other direction to make sure nothing else was coming. Finally, the last zombie vanished around the corner, and Jinx smacked Zion on the arm, speaking low. "Let's get to work," he said quietly. They broke from cover, making it to the door, which had noise coming from inside it. They listened carefully for a brief moment, hearing what sounded like only a single creature clawing at the heavy wooden door. Zion looked at the lock, and it didn't appear to be very strong. "I can kick it in, but we might get some unwanted attention," he warned. "Do it," Jinx replied firmly. Zion stepped back, kicking the door forcefully and cracking the locking mechanism. He kicked it again, and the door cracked open. Immediately a set of decaying fingers squeezed through, yanking the door open. Zion kicked it one more time, sending the ghoul flying back into the room. Jinx rushed in, shining his flashlight to find the zombie and jamming his blade into its skull. Zion entered quickly and shut the door as well as he could. The maintenance room was small but tidy. There were a couple of desks along the wall, as well as a hook with keys on it. There were maps everywhere on the wall, and papers on the desk. "Grab the keys, I got the maps," the corporal instructed. They gathered up everything they could, and Jinx went back to the door and peeked out. A few of the zombies had heard the break-in and were shambling back towards them. 30 seconds, and we gotta move," he warned, thumbing through the maps, but none of them were blueprints. He looked to the corner, finding some rolled-up blueprints, and snatched them up. "Got 'em! Let's move!" he hissed, and the duo rushed from the room, just a few steps ahead of a zombie with several friends following it. "We're moving, Jarvis!" Jinx yelled as they ran back down the hallway, making it back to the doorway where the private stood, as casually as if she'd been waiting for the bus.
"Was wondering when you boys were going to show up," she drawled.
"That's my girl," Jinx quipped, clapping her on the shoulder. They made it to the stairwell, slamming the door and moving down the next landing.
"You get it?"
she asked. Jinx held up the maps and blueprints with a grin. "If there's a way into that room, it's here," he said. "Let me see that light," Zion urged. Jarvis shone her flashlight onto him as he went through several sets of keys. He held one up with a tag that said storage. "Why take the long way when we can walk through the front door?" he asked with a smirk. "My man," Jinx commended. "Come on, let's knock this out." The group exited on the first floor, moving quickly through the empty corridors to the main storage area. There was a small stairwell that led downstairs to a landing, which had the security door. Zion grabbed the key, sliding it in and unlocking it. As he turned the knob and opened the door towards him, he was immediately greeted by a chorus of moans. Almost immediately, several ghouls tried to get out, pushing hard. Zion pressed his body against the door to hold it shut, and the other two started stabbing. They took down a couple of zombies that fell to the ground, the corpses blocking the door from being shut. "Pull the bodies out!" Zion cried. Jarvis complied as Jinx continued to fight, pushing back against the arms as they flailed about, trying to grab them. He looked past the ones at the front of the door, and there were dozens of zombies in the smallish room, all of which were coming their way. "Shit!" the corporal muttered and reached over, grabbing Zion's weapon from his hand. He raised it, getting ready to use it as Jarvis pulled the last body out of the way. "When I shove, you slam that door!" Jinx barked. "Do it!" Zion replied. Jinx put the weapon in the center of the lead ghoul's chest, shoving as hard as he could. Jarvis braced against his back, shoving and helping to push the mob back. They managed to heave them back a couple of feet, and he nodded for Jarvis to back up. "Now!" Jinx barked, and quickly yanked the weapon before Zion slammed the door shut, locking it back up. The trio sat there, breathing heavily, knowing they narrowly dodged death once again. "So," Zion huffed, "what's plan B?" They looked around at each other before all staring down at the mess of maps and blueprints on the floor. "We find another way in," Jinx said with a sigh. "And then what?" Jarvis asked. He raised a finger. "First things first," he declared. "We gotta find a way in." She nodded, and they gathered the papers, poring through the maps and blueprints, and hoping to find another way into the zombie-infested room. Chapter 4. Several hours had passed with the group studying the blueprints, trying to figure out a way inside that didn't involve them going through dozens of ghouls. Jinx held up another blueprint, trying to make heads or tails of it, finally giving up and tossing it to the ground. Zion had completely given up and punched in the timers on the explosives for noon, figuring they could always turn them off if they needed to. "We're running out of time," Jinx said as he looked at his watch. "What time is it?" Zion asked. "A little after 7, the corporal replied. "Shit. We're going to need a plan B," Zion muttered. Jinx motioned to the door. "If you can get that door open wide enough, I can throw as many of these explosives in there and we can hope for the best," he suggested. Zion shook his head. "For all we know, the things we need to hit are on the other side of the room, or behind concrete," he said. "Yeah, you're right. We need to get in there and set them properly if this is going to work," Jinx agreed with a sigh. "Maybe we can get one of those gurneys from upstairs," Zion mused, "and use it to hold the door in place and take them out one by one." The corporal wrinkled his nose. "That sounds exhausting," he said. "Oh, it will be, but couldn't take more than an hour or two to pull off," Zion said with a shrug. "Dangerous, too, unless we can find something with a little more reach," Jinx said, holding up his knife. "This thing is great, just not for that situation." As the two of them talked, Jarvis continued to work on the blueprints and maps, shuffling some papers around, not paying them any attention. "What do you think, Jarvis?" Jinx asked, turning towards her. She was intently focused on the paperwork in front of her, and didn't answer. This intrigued both men, and they sat up to pay attention to her. "You got something, girl?" Zion asked. "Maybe. Just give me a second," she said. The two men shut up, looking at each other and sharing a shrug, but sitting in silence to give her room to work and think. After several moments, she looked up. "You two can keep talking," she said. "In fact, please do so, because it's a little creepy to have you just staring at me." Zion winced. "Sorry," he said. Jinx smirked, glancing at the other man. "So, how about that local sports team?" he drawled. "Oh yeah, the one that did the thing that one time?" Zion joked. "Loved them." "Fuck you both," Jarvis muttered. The men laughed as she continued working through the maps, but before they could start up again, she slapped down one of the blueprints, pointing to the far corner. "Got it," she said confidently. They leaned over to look, but Jinx shook his head. "Okay, I'm man enough to admit that I have no idea what I'm looking at," he said. Zion nodded in agreement. "That shit might as well be calculus," he said. "Best I can tell, it's a ventilation access panel," Jarvis explained. "Ventilation ducts?" Jinx asked. "Girl, this ain't the movies," Zion quipped. "You can't be climbing through those." No, look," Jarvis said, shaking her head. "The ventilation ducts going along beside this access panel. I guess, because of the room and what they have stored down there, they have to have special ventilation. No clue if it's a filter or what. All I know is that this thing is made for a person to go through." "Are you sure?" Jinx asked. Jarvis nodded. "Relatively so," she said. "My dad did some contracting work back in the day, and I'm trying to remember the specific stuff from when I'd watch him work." "Shit. Good enough for me," Zion said. "How do we get to it?" Jinx asked. "I gotta go outside for it," Jarvis said. Both men stared at her, clearly not thrilled about the idea.
Are you sure? Jinx asked. I am, she assured him. At least about the outside part. Looks like there is an access panel along the back wall that leads down to this point.
Can you get into the room? Zion asked. She shook her head.
I don't think so, but it will give me access to this ventilation duct that leads directly into the room, she explained. I figure I can get over there, make a hell of a racket, and draw them to that side of the room. At the very least, it'll give you an opportunity to get inside and have an opening to do what you need to do.
Jinx sighed.
Not my favorite plan, but I don't have a better one, he admitted.
Me either, Zion said.
Okay then,
Jarvis said, getting to her feet. Wait, Zion blurted, looking through the keys and selecting one that was labeled Outer Maintenance Door. This might help. She read the label and nodded in appreciation.
Just a bit, she said.
He winked as she pocketed the key. Jinx looked at his watch.
We have a little more than 3 hours before our diversion bomb goes off, he said. I'd like to be on the move before that happens. Okay, I'll make the noise until either of you tell me to stop or it hits 10:45, Jarvis said.
Don't know how many of those things are in there, Jinx said. If it's not too bad, we'll take them out, but we may have to just sneak around.
Do what you gotta do, Jarvis said, but I'll be at the house across the street by 11 if I don't hear from you.
Be careful, Jinx said firmly. Yeah, you be careful, girl, Zion added. She threw him a wink of her own before heading back up to the first floor, gripping her knife tightly as she moved back through the hospital. When she made it to the front door, she looked out towards the mob by the car. The zombies still trying to get inside to whatever was trapped in there. The sunlight made everything bright, straining her eyes to adjust after living the past few hours by flashlight.
Guess I'm taking the long way around, she thought,
and gently opened the front sliding doors. She shut them gently and silently behind her, moving gently across the parking lot so she didn't disturb the hungry masses. She made it to the side of the building, greeted by a handful of ghouls that were in the grass on that side. They immediately groaned and came her way, and she let out a sigh, knowing she'd have to deal with them. Jarvis stepped up, slicing and dicing the creatures as she worked her way through and around them. She stabbed one in the side of the head before spinning it around, slamming it into 2 others, ripping the blade from its head and attacking the others on the ground. Finally, there was just one left, and she stepped straight up to it, jamming her knife into its eye before throwing it to the ground. She let out a grunt, exhaustion starting to set in, but her heart raced from the strenuous activity. She made her way around to the back of the building, finding an employee parking lot. There were several zombies moving around between cars, just wandering aimlessly. The lot was about 40 yards from the building, with a nice tree-lined area separating it.
Maybe that will be enough to cover me, she thought. Maybe. Hopefully.
She took a deep breath before embarking, staying low as she moved against the wall.
An hour ago, and this would have been a lot easier.
She kept moving up quickly, pausing at a walkway that led to a back employee entrance. She looked down towards the parking lot, seeing several zombies shambling by the opening. She waited for several moments until they were out of her line of sight before moving. She walked softly across the sidewalk, getting to the grass and continuing her quest. She found the maintenance door, which was contained within a chain-link fence about waist-high. She hopped over it, staying low once she landed. Jarvis inserted the key, turning it, relieved to feel the doorknob turning as she did. Before opening, she braced for an attack, but it didn't come as she pulled the door open towards her. She slipped inside, quietly closing it behind her. She hid her flashlight, seeing a stairwell going down towards a small room at the bottom of the stairs. When she made it down, she saw it was a tiny room with some shelves to one side, with various things on it, and an access panel to the left. Jarvis approached it, removing the casing to see what was inside. There were several filters in there, as well as some other mechanical stuff. She quickly threw out the filters, looking down towards the room, shining her flashlight. There was about 15 yards between the filters and the grate at the bottom, which was only slightly open. She looked around the room, going back over to the shelf and looking through it. Finally, she found a heavy metal case, some component that did something vital at some point, but now was virtually worthless, except for this brief moment where she was going to give it a new life. She went back to the duct, using both hands to throw the heavy case down the chute. It slammed into the grate with incredible force, knocking it clean off. She shone her flashlight into the room, finding that the noise had attracted the attention of some of the ghouls. Jarvis started yelling, her voice echoing off of the metal ventilation system.
"Yeah, come on and get me," she bellowed. "I'm up here."
She continued the diversion, yelling at the top of her lungs and using her flashlight to bang against the metal. She shone her light back down there, seeing that there were zombies everywhere, pressed up against the wall, and going back as far as she could see.
"Okay, boys. You be careful," she said.
Chapter 5. Several minutes had passed since Zion and Jinx heard Jarvis making a racket. They had their ears to the door, listening for moans, none of which sounded like they were near the door.
"Open it just a touch,"
Jinx whispered. Zion nodded, putting his foot into anchor position to make sure it couldn't go further than a few inches. He opened it, and the corporal looked through. The zombies were about 20 yards away, focused on the ventilation system. There were wooden boxes to the right, and to the left was a row of metal pipes and a pathway that went further back to the left. But he couldn't see in there. He motioned for Zion to shut the door.
"Okay, there's a path to the left with some cover. Let's get in there and get behind the pipes,"
Jinx said quietly.
"We can start figuring out what's what."
"How many of those things can you see?" Zion asked.
"Too many,"
Jinx said.
"Come on."
That answer didn't instill confidence in Zion, but he nodded and fell in line, readying his weapon in the shoving back position. Jinx opened the door quietly, the duo moving through before he quietly shut it behind them. The light coming from the ventilation shaft was just enough for them to make out what was going on in the room, but not much else. Zion made it around the corner, going behind the row of pipes. Jinx was right behind him, turning on his flashlight and shining it against his chest to minimize the light exposure. It was bright enough to show them the way. There were several large pipes to their left, running horizontally, and the pipes up to their right running vertically, floor to ceiling. They stopped at several of them, trying to figure out what they were for, but unable to. Still, they planted a couple of bombs just in case. They didn't need them all to be right, just one. Zion continued to move up, but was startled by a zombie reaching its arm out from the horizontal pipes, grabbing him. Zion wrenched himself free, but not before his weapon smacked against a metal pipe, sending a loud metallic sound through the air. Jinx looked over at the zombie, and it was someone who had wedged itself in there, presumably to get away from zombies that had been attacking it when it was still human. Once it reanimated, it was stuck. Jinx jammed his knife into its head, ending its misery, but the damage had been done. Moans came from the other side of the room, only a little bit louder as several had turned towards them. Jinx motioned for Zion to move up ahead to the end of the row of pipes. Before he could get there, several ghouls came around the corner, excited to see a fresh meal there. Zion tried his best to attack with his weapon, but it was tight quarters, so he had to jab forward with it. He managed to crack the front of one of the zombie skulls, but the other three were just pushed back. "Jinx!" Zion barked. The corporal saw what was happening, so he took point, using his knife to dispatch the first one. He held it up, pushing it back towards the other two, pinning them against the pipes that were behind them. Arms flailed, trying to grab him from around their fallen comrade, but they couldn't quite find him. It took a few attempts, but Jinx managed to stab the other two before dropping them to the ground. He turned and saw that the majority of the zombies turned towards them, with several already moving towards the door.
"Jarvis!" Jinx bellowed. "We need a diversion, now!"
Yelling and banging echoed from the ventilation shaft, pulling a few of the zombies back towards her, but there was still a couple dozen coming their way.
"We're running out of options,"
Zion cried.
"I know,"
Jinx yelled back.
"Take point."
Zion followed the order, with Jinx handing him a knife as he passed. The corporal climbed up a bit, bracing himself on the pipes so he could see over the ghouls' heads. He shone his flashlight around for more pipes, seeing a few over by the ventilation ducts.
"Jarvis!" he cried. "Throw 4 bombs down the chute!"
"To go off now?" she yelled back, clearly confused.
"No!"
Jinx yelled back.
"Got it!"
Jarvis yelled, and 4 bombs clattered down the duct. They banged off of the metal and hit some zombies before finding a spot on the floor close to the pipes. Jinx continued to scan the room as Zion started stabbing and shoving ghouls back, trying to hold the mob at bay. Most of the rest of the room was unremarkable. However, he could see a cinder-block room at the far corner on his side of the room. There was a sign on the side of it that showed the flammable warning and oxygen.
"I found it!"
he cried.
"Where?"
Zion demanded.
"Someplace I don't want to go,"
the corporal admitted, surveying his options as Zion continued to fight off the zombies. He looked ahead down the tight corridor between the pipes. There was a head-height horizontal pipe going across, creating a bit of an opening to the next area that was adjacent to the oxygen room. He shone his light, and there weren't any ghouls on that side.
"I'll be right back,"
he said.
"Wait!"
Zion yelped.
"What?"
Before Jinx could explain, he jumped on the horizontal pipes to his left, grabbing some of the piping above him. He started to run along them as Zion shoved more corpses back. Jinx avoided getting tripped up as he ran to the opening, diving through. He barely fit with his explosives bag, grabbing onto it to slow his speed down so he could gracefully land on the floor. He knew the noise he'd just made was going to attract attention, so he ran as quickly as he could to the oxygen room. There was a door that he grabbed and threw open, revealing some intricate pipework inside. He looked around, trying to figure out where to plant the bombs.
"Fuck it,"
he muttered, and took off the bag, throwing the whole thing in there before shutting the door. He turned back towards the mess of ghouls, finding himself totally cut off from Zion and the door, at least on the floor. His only chance was to go back the way he came.
"I'm coming back,"
he yelled. He wasn't sure if Zion heard him, but he didn't have the luxury of waiting to make sure. The zombies were nearly on him, and he had to move. Jinx took off running, keeping away from the outstretched hands as much as he could. He leapt up, planting his foot on some pipes to his right to boost him up, diving right through the opening. He had too much speed, not able to slow himself down. He flew right through, landing on top of 3 zombies with their backs to him. They tumbled to the ground in a heap, with more hungry ghouls behind him. The lead duo of them reached down, just about to grab onto his leg and have a feast. Zion grabbed him by the shirt collar and pulled with everything he had, narrowly getting him out of harm's way by a whisker. Jinx face planted on the pavement as Zion went into a frenzy, stabbing and kicking the ghouls back. Jinx shook off the bump, getting himself up.
"We're good. Let's go,"
he cried. Zion gave one last shove as they turned and rushed back towards the door, only to find some zombies coming around from that end too. Zion lowered his shoulder, driving through them, picking up a couple and tossing them in that direction. He managed to knock just enough over to give them a narrow path to the door. They ran to it, getting through and slamming it back just before the zombies got there. Through heaving breaths, they shook their heads in disbelief. You are one crazy white boy, Zion huffed.
No argument there, Jinx replied with a grin. You good?
Yeah, just lost my weapon in there, Zion replied, a note of disappointment in his voice.
The corporal smirked. Promise I'll buy you a new one, he said.
Damn well better, Zion quipped.
Shit, Jinx muttered.
What?
Zion asked. Forgot to tell Jarvis we're leaving, the corporal admitted, jerking a thumb over his shoulder.
You can go back in there if you want,
Zion offered, cocking his head. Jinx shook his head. I think I've had my fill, he said dryly.
Then we can go around back and grab her, Zion suggested. We got time, right?
The corporal checked his watch. Plenty, he said.
Let's go get her and get the hell out of here then, Zion said.
The two men got to their feet and headed upstairs to retrieve their partner and begin their escape. Chapter 6. The group sat in the house across the street, their muscles aching, exhausted beyond belief. They'd been there for a while, recovering before making their move back to shore.
What's your time looking like?
Zion asked. 10:37, Jinx replied after checking his watch.
Zion sighed. We should start moving east towards the river, he suggested. At least a few blocks.
Agreed, the corporal said. Get down a bit, let the diversion go off, pull them away from the river, and hopefully be well on our way home by the time the hospital goes up.
Jarvis blinked slowly.
Feels a little strange to be running ahead of schedule, she said. Usually we're scrambling. Unlike most of our missions, we have some top-notch help here, Jinx said with a grin.
Zion shrugged sheepishly. Just doing my part, he said.
And doing it well, Jinx said, clapping him on the back. Come on, let's get hiking. The trio packed up, heading for the back door and checking for movement before exiting. They walked through the yards, staying quiet as they went, taking their time because they knew they had a diversion going off within the half hour. Zombies scattered across the road, some which had no doubt shambled in from the first explosion from earlier. They were spread out fairly thin, though, and the group moved right past them easily. The trip down the next couple of blocks wasn't too bad, just a smattering of ghouls, nothing too threatening. This changed as they grew closer to the north in the direction of the docks. They came to a road and spotted a couple hundred of the creatures in the roadway, the first diversion apparently not enticing enough for them. The trio took cover at the side of a house as Jinx checked his watch. 3 minutes, he said quietly.
How close are we?
Zion asked. The river is just on that side of the road, Jinx replied. But we're a good 3-4 blocks south of the dock. We can just head down to the river and call it a day, Jarvis suggested. Jinx shook his head. We have miles to go, and it's going to be a bitch to keep our heads above water without a boat. We need to get back to them, he said. She and Zion nodded in agreement. They stood there, silently waiting for the diversion to go off. Finally, the clock struck 11, and there was a slight, muffled explosion in the distance. The trio exchanged confused glances.
Was that it?
Zion hissed. Jarvis shook her head. What the hell happened? She asked. Jinx shrugged. Maybe that earlier house explosion damaged the gas line? He asked. Triggered a safety valve for the neighborhood?
Fuck it. Doesn't matter why, Zion cut in. What are we going to do now?
They stood in thought for a moment before Jinx motioned to Jarvis's bag. You still have explosives left? He asked. She nodded. Yeah, a couple, she said. I turned them off, of course.
Give them here, Jinx urged.
What are you doing? Zion asked. We have to go through them, or at least get them out of our way long enough to get past them, Jinx said. Jarvis shook her head. But won't that pull more our way? She asked. More than likely, the corporal confirmed. I hope you're ready to run. she sighed. Never a light jog with you, she muttered. He chuckled as he punched 2 minutes into the timer. You be ready to take off when these things go off, he warned. The other 2 nodded, and he started moving up the yards towards the mob. When he was within 30 yards of them, he flicked the timer, getting the clock rolling. He stopped at 20 yards away and then threw the bombs as hard as he could, one at a time. The devices fluttered through the air, one landing about 6 zombies deep, the other near the middle of the pack. This got their attention, and some turned towards him, moaning and stumbling towards the soldier as he retreated. He made it back to the others, taking cover just before detonation. The blast was horrific, sending body parts and full bodies flying through the air, sending a fireball through the mob. They peeked back out, seeing that there were charred and flaming corpses everywhere, but a path had opened in the middle of them. Zion took charge, leading them out from behind cover. They ran as hard as they could, trying to get through the mob before they could get back to their feet. They had to get close enough to them that they could feel the heat coming off the flames. As they approached the back end of the group, a few of the creatures, still on fire, managed to stand and stagger towards them. Zion bowled through them, sending the corpses slamming into the ground, but his clothes caught fire in the process. He didn't miss a beat, smacking his arm to put out the flames as he continued to run. They didn't stop, knowing they'd just sent a signal up to every ghoul in the area as to where they were. They made it a few blocks up, looking to the side at dozens of creatures emerging from houses and streets, coming towards them. The trio ran hard until they reached the docks, which had a couple dozen zombies packed tightly together in the parking lot, in front of the building. Zion paused, weighing whether or not he could get through them. Before he could try, though, Jinx stepped up. "We got this," he said firmly. "Jarvis?" She nodded, knowing exactly what he was thinking, and the duo drew their handguns, taking careful aim and plugging round after round into rotted heads, as if they were at a carnival shooting gallery. They each burned through an entire magazine of ammunition, never wasting a single shot, leaving only 2 standing at the end. As they reloaded, Zion stepped forward. "My turn," he said. The creatures shambled towards him, a few yards apart from each other. He picked one up, immediately slamming it down onto the other's head, before doing the same thing to the other one. He playfully swiped his palms against one another. "I believe our boat's await," he said with a flourish. They headed through the shop, making it to the back and down to the docks, where there were thankfully no zombies, only boats. They unlatched the crafts while climbing in. Several zombies emerged from the store, coming down the docks towards them, but the trio didn't panic, simply moved at a steady pace. When they got their boats free and shoved off from the dock, paddling away, several of the ghouls fell into the water behind them, pushed by their excited brethren. "That's some fancy shooting you were doing there," Zion commended as they began their float trip. Jarvis smirked. "I'm more than just a pretty face," she said. "Oh, I got that," Zion assured her. "You sure there, bud?" Jinx asked playfully. Zion leveled him with a stare. "Yeah, why wouldn't I?" he asked. "Well, before you make your move, just remember how well she shoots," the corporal said. "And remember that you can't run as fast as a bullet." "Jinx!" Jarvis gasped, putting a hand to her chest in offense. "Like I would ever shoot someone in that situation." "You mean again?" the corporal drawled, and she opened her mouth, closing it for a beat as a memory seemed to wash over her. She wrinkled her nose and then nodded. "Okay, yeah, again," she corrected. "You shot somebody?" Zion prompted. She held up a finger. "In my defense, he was a dick," she declared. "Couple inches to the left and he wouldn't have been," Jinx quipped. "Whoa, all right," Zion said, though he didn't look worried as he appraised her.
A girl that doesn't mess around. I can get behind that." They all shared a laugh as they continued to float down the river. They didn't bother paddling, letting the current do the work for them. As far as they were concerned, they had done enough for the day. Most of the hour passed as they floated downstream, Jinx continually checking his watch. "1 more minute," he finally said.
"We still close enough to hear it?" Jarvis asked.
The corporal took a deep breath. "If this goes the way I hope it does," he drawled, "then you should be able to hear it in Seattle." She gaped at him. "Okay, I'm exaggerating a bit," Jinx admitted sheepishly. "But yeah, we're still more than close enough to hear it." Zion took a deep breath. "I hope this works, man, because I don't have a plan B to get Adam and his group out," he said, sounding worried and uncertain for the first time since the soldiers had met him. "I threw my entire bag of explosives into that room," Jinx said. "So if it's operational, then it should work. Won't be for lack of trying if it doesn't." They shared a nod, and he looked down at his watch, staring at the second hand rapidly making its trip around. "Okay, here we go," he finally said. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. He paused, looking back in the direction of the hospital. Several moments of uncomfortable silence passed, and their hearts sank until there was a deep rumbling. Finally, the explosion hit the air, a huge plume of smoke rising in the distance, windows rattling, smaller aftershock explosions echoing after. Jinx clapped his hands. "There we go!" he cried. Zion let out a whoop. "Hell yeah!" he yelled. "If that doesn't clear them out, I don't know what will."
"Every zombie for 10 miles is going to descend on that pit," Jarvis declared.
"And I can officially check off hospital on my list of buildings I've blown up," Jinx added.
"That's all of them, isn't it?"
Jarvis teased. He shrugged. "I mean, I still want to do a stadium one day, but that dream may be a little too big," he admitted. "Well, if I have any say about it, you'll get your dream," Zion said. "Least I can do after what you've done for me." The corporal offered him a warm smile. "It was what you asked for in order for me to earn your trust," he said. "I was more than happy to do it." "Jinx, you've earned my trust, my respect, and a whole lot more," Zion assured him. "I can't thank you enough." The corporal smirked. "Well, you say that now," he joked. Zion laughed. "You should know that's the most heartfelt thanks I've ever given in my life," he said. "And I will treasure it," Jinx promised, with a hand over his heart.
"Okay, before you two demand to pull over and hug it out, or worse, what do you say we get moving?" Jarvis cut in. "I'm ready to get back to solid land and to a warm bed."
"Can't say I disagree with that at all," Zion said. "Okay, long day of paddling," Jinx quipped. "Let's get moving." Chapter 7. Several hours had passed since the detonation, and the group was continually paddling downriver. They had gone miles and miles, and their arms felt like rubber, even Zion's.
"How much further is this place?"
Jarvis huffed. "Shouldn't be too much more, girl," Zion replied. "If you want to take a break, I can handle paddling."
"I just might take you up on that in a few minutes," she murmured.
They paddled for a few more moments, coming around a bend in the river. An older truck sitting on the shore flashed its lights and honked the horn. Fingers got out of the driver's seat waving. "Oh, thank God," Jinx blurted. "My arms feel like they're about to fall off." They paddled over to shore, and Fingers helped them leave the boats. "Good to see everyone's in one piece," he said, then paused, looking over the trio.
Everyone is in one piece, aren't they?
Yeah, we're good, Jinx assured him. Just tired as hell. Fighting zombies, blowing up hospitals, and canoeing for half a day really takes it out of you. Have you heard from Calvin? Zion demanded, anxiety clear in his tone.
Relax, Fingers replied. I heard from Calvin, and everything went according to plan. Whatever you did at the hospital worked. Took about an hour for those things to get away from Adams's place.
So there weren't any problems? Jinx asked. Fingers shook his head.
From the way Calvin was talking, it sounded like the streets were so clear that Adam's group just walked right out the front door. They didn't even have to use the sewers to get back to the bridge, he said.
They already back at town? Zion asked. Fingers hesitated, gritting his teeth briefly, and his response put everyone at unease. Fingers, Jinx said slowly. What's going on?
Yeah, they're back at town, the other man replied. But there's a situation.
What's happened? Zion demanded. Is it Monique? Fingers shook his head.
No, it's that sergeant you brought back, he said.
He's not dead, is he? Jinx asked.
Roughed up pretty good, but not dead,
Fingers assured him. What the hell happened? Zion asked. Fingers sighed.
Guard went to feed him breakfast, and he overpowered him, he explained. Guard's fine, just has a hell of a headache. But that sergeant, he got out of his cell and got to his things.
He didn't have any weapons, Zion said, shaking his head.
Shit,
Jinx muttered. What? Zion asked, cocking his head. Jinx pulled out his emergency beacon, holding it up. Fingers nodded, pointing to it.
Yeah, he had one of those things, he said. Even injured, he's a tough bastard. Took 3 guys wailing on him just to get him to drop it, holding onto it like a junkyard dog on a neighborhood kid.
Did you turn it off? Jinx asked.
No, didn't know it had an off switch, Fingers admitted. We couldn't figure out why he was holding onto it for dear life.
We have to go, now, Jinx said, stuffing his back in his pocket.
What the hell is that thing, anyway?
Fingers said. It's an emergency distress beacon, Jinx explained.
The military is going to be sending troops to his position.
Fingers' eyes widened.
That's bad, he said.
The corporal nodded. It's really bad, he agreed. They're already on edge, which is why they sent us, seeing that they're not only going to be coming, but they're going to be coming in hot.
What time did it go off?
Jarvis asked.
About 3 hours ago, I think,
Fingers replied. Shit, they might already be there, Zion said.
Everyone in, I'm driving,
Jinx snapped.
Fingers held up a hand. Nobody drives my truck, he shot back firmly, and nobody drives it faster than me.
Jinx sized him up, but easily recognized the crazed driver look in his eyes.
You slow down for nothing, he warned. I never do, Fingers promised.
The group piled into the cab, knowing they were going to be going fast and holding on tight. As soon as they were squeezed in, Fingers punched the gas and they zipped down the open road.
Who are they going to send?
Jarvis asked, squashed between Jinx and Zion as they flew along.
Hard to say with Captain Odom, Jinx admitted. If they're lucky, he'll just send Dickerson and his squad. I'm on good terms with him. He'll listen to me.
Zion peeked over at him. And if we're not lucky? He asked.
Jinx sighed. He could send down multiple squads, some of whom don't have the restraint that I have, he said. Some of whom I've pissed off over the last month and who just might end up shooting me if given half a chance.
Fingers, drive faster, Zion demanded.
Ain't gotta tell me twice,
Fingers replied. How long until we're there? Jinx asked urgently.
With the way I drive, about 45 minutes,
Fingers said, pushing the gas even harder. The mood in the vehicle was somber and anxious, and in Jinx's mind was only one mantra. Please be Dickerson, he thought. Please be Dickerson. Please be Dickerson. The end.